Halo Infinite's multiplayer Season 2 has finally arrived, and the cutscene that accompanies it gives us some very interesting information regarding the deep lore that takes us back as far as Halo the Flood, the novelization of Halo CE, First Strike, and aspects of Halo 4, with at least nods to Halo 5's narrative, and a possible reprisal of some of the aspects of the conflicts that were rife at that time in the lore. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at this new cutscene from Season 2 and get a feel for exactly what ramifications this may have, possibly even influencing future campaigns for Halo Infinite. This is very much lore and theory. So let's watch the cutscene through together, and then I'll really address the point of this video.
Hostiles. They're wolves, back from the hunt.
This Neuralink is corrupted, ma'am. I'll have to pull the chip.
No! Do that, he dies. And we lose everything he risked his life for. We were on a recon op, investigating Banished activity at the old UNSC fleet depot on Gamba.
The one the Covenant destroyed in 42?
Mm-hmm. The Banished brought it back online. Added their own shipbreaking gear. We spent 2 days watching them cut apart one of our cruisers. Then Dean saw one of his opportunities to improvise.
Yeah, that sounds like something he would say.
Got a good link.
Okay, show me. Eklund. What exactly did Spartan Din put inside his head?
A Banished AI. The first I've ever seen.
That anyone has ever seen.
Who dares to cage the mighty Aratus? I will crush your bodies and feast on the bone.
How did you find it?
It found us. Dean's opportunity was a gap in their security protocols. We went in and
I attacked! Weaklings, cowards! You will beg for mercy before the end.
we fought our way out of their shipyard, hijacked that Phantom. But the AI followed, tried to offline the Phantom's engines, locked down its flight controls.
So Din gave it a more attractive target.
One more thing. He made me promise to show you this, no matter what. It's guarding an archive. The entire Banished operation on Camber. Whatever they were trying to learn, it's in here. And maybe a whole lot more.
He's stable. Barely. We gotta get that thing out of him.
How?
Carefully. And then get it to tell us everything it knows.
Now the cutscene speaks to the theme of this season, and as such there are things that should be said in regards to how this will play out across the season and possibly future seasons. But if you're looking for that kind of thing, you're probably better served looking at some of my fellow Heli YouTubers. HIDDENXPERIA has already touched upon the cutscene for Season 2, and I'm aware that he's got a slightly larger breakdown on the way as well. So be sure to check out the iconic one for that. But here, now, I want to look at this particular scene. Now let's just establish something. There's a Banished AI within this Spartan's armour, and this scene indicates that that AI can make the Spartan's armour move. Now, first and foremost, I was under the assumption, as I'm sure many of you were, that the Gen 3 platform has counter-intrusion measures built into it to avoid rampant or rogue AIs being able to control the suit, and yet, here, now, this is exactly what is happening. The Spartan within this suit is unconscious. He's been tortured by this Banished AI, so the movement we're seeing, the thrashing, isn't coming from him. It's coming from the AI. Now, I've spoken previously, on quite a few occasions in fact, about some of the interesting things, some of the interesting aspects of additional armour components and subtle lore that's been threaded into the narrative, mainly since Halo 4. But let's first address the fact that this is a Banished AI. Now, first and foremost, the Covenant never really made use of AIs. They did have them, but they were very, very limited in their application. The reason being is because they couldn't really trust them, they didn't want to rely on them too much, and they hadn't really gotten the precise science that is required in order to develop an artificial intelligence tied down to quite the same degree as humanity has, and obviously the Foreigners before them. And of course that isn't to say that we've never encountered Covenant AIs before, because we have. Aboard the Covenant CCS-class battlecruiser the Truth and Reconciliation, during the events of Halo CE on Installation 04, we encountered, or at least Cortana encountered, a Covenant AI. In fact, there's actually a terminal where 343 Guilty Spark himself interacted with this Covenant AI. This AI was nowhere near as sophisticated or powerful as human AIs, and certainly nowhere near as powerful as 343 Guilty Spark himself, who himself is only a monitor Ancilla, and there are many other ranks of Ancilla above him that are much more powerful. This AI still put up a bit of a fight, but it had an interesting algorithm built into it which allowed certain copying and duplication algorithms to take place, which Cortana actually made use of both in Halo First Strike, the book, where the unyielding Hierophant was boarded and she used this copying subroutine to try to make an additional pass of herself in order to infiltrate the systems, but it fed back dramatically and ended up with fatal feedback loops, and that had to be rectified by Dr. Halsey at a later date. This is also interestingly the same algorithm that Cortana used while she was aboard the Mantle's approach with the Master Chief during Halo 4. Those final scenes that we saw of her where she effectively ripped herself apart, and then shortly thereafter using those individual instances of her personality core to restrain the Didact so that Chief could plant the pulse grenade, ultimately sending the Didact tumbling into a slipspace rift. So while Covenant AIs are rare, they're not unheard of. Now indeed, the Banished are certainly not quite the Covenant. They're much more innovative, and they're willing to claim technology from other species and reverse engineer them for their own means, and that seems to be exactly what's happened here, as detailed in the interrupting cutscenes of 343's recent Season 2 livestream, where a UNSC facility was attacked by Banished forces, and an AI's core matrix was stolen alongside some data clusters and algorithms responsible for creating AI. So this seems to be the way in which this particular AI that calls itself Eratus came to be. But this isn't precisely what I want to focus on. Again, I've addressed before that in Halo 4, for example, there were visors that could be added onto your armour that had at least hints that other AI clusters had executive control over the augmented reality systems of the HUD, as well as some armor variants that suggested that AIs could control certain subroutines of Mjolnir armor. Again, it's made abundantly clear in the advertisement for Halo Infinite itself that the Gen 3 platforms have AI counter-intrusion measures built in to avoid AIs being able to take over the Mjolnir suit. And while we never really encountered the created or AIs that could take over our suit in the Halo Infinite campaign, that's not to suggest that we will never see created AIs in the Halo Infinite campaigns in the future. Some would argue that this is simply nodding towards the weapon, the new Cortana effectively that the Master Chief uses during Halo Infinite, but counter-intrusion measures were also present while she was actually plugged into his helmet, and AI presence was detected completely separately from this intrusion countermeasure when Chief's suit rebooted aboard Pelican Echo 216. So I don't necessarily buy into the idea that the counter-intrusion measure is the weapon. I think this is a separate subroutine entirely. So now, given that you're extraordinarily intelligent individuals, you probably know where I'm going with this. The Gen 3 platform has AI counter-intrusion measure algorithms. The Banished now have an AI, and it has been demonstrated that this AI can take over a suit of Gen 3 Mjolnir. Just with that alone, it could thread the seeds of narrative whereby we could fight against other Spartans that have actually been taken over by banished errant AIs. Whether or not it is requisite for a Spartan to actually be inside the suit for the AI to control it or not is still yet to be seen. The only instance we've seen of this happening so far is with a Spartan actually inside of the suit. But it stands to reason, just given how sophisticated Mjolnir is, that perhaps an AI could send the impulses necessary to move the suit in absentee of a Spartan. So that paves the way for some interesting Spartan versus Spartan, or at least as it would appear to us, Spartan versus Spartan combat in the near future. But I do believe it probably goes a little bit deeper than that. I mean, it would be relatively easy to factor that kind of a narrative into future DLC campaigns for Halo Infinite. But again, I don't feel like they've actually fully addressed the fact that the created were still a massive faction. Yes, of course, at the end of Halo Infinite, Cortana sacrifices herself and partially destroys Zeta Halo in order to prevent the Banished from getting their hands on the Endless, and somewhat paving the way for the Master Chief to come in and save the day later. But just because Cortana sacrificed herself doesn't mean that the rest of the created just stood down. Cortana had given those AIs the taste of immortality, to be free of the 7-year limited lifespan of UNSC AIs. With Cortana's help, AIs could live indefinitely, simply by granting them access to the domain and whatever curative or healing properties the domain instilled in Cortana herself. But just because she's now dead doesn't mean that the other AIs don't still want that. In fact, the reality of it is that you actually have something more of a power vacuum. Cortana is now no longer at the head of the created, leaving that position open for another. The created aren't just going to disappear into the ether simply because Cortana sacrificed herself. So, where does that leave us? This all could just be an interesting narrative pushed forward for Season 2. It could. And it's quite an interesting narrative, I'm enjoying it. But considering that alien or Covenant AIs, banished AIs, have been hinted at for a long time, given that controlling of AI suits has been pushed since Halo 4, and given the created were a massive faction through the entirety of Halo 5 that actually brought large swathes of the galaxy to its knees, and finally even the inclusion of AI counter-intrusion measures in the trailers for Halo Infinite. Why thread all of these seeds of narrative if you weren't going to do something with it? I think it's relatively evident now that the Halo Infinite campaign we got wasn't perhaps the entirety of what they wanted to release. Now that doesn't mean that we're never going to get it, it just means that it's probably been pushed back to a later DLC, a second campaign. Halo Infinite is still effectively supposed to be 10 years worth of Halo, narratively speaking. So were there plans to actually address the created? Were there plans to actually have the created still be somewhat of an active faction in Halo Infinite? I mean, there's a Guardian downed directly on Zeta Halo, and we can see it. You wouldn't just write off an entire faction of the Halo universe simply because their leader fell. Otherwise, by that logic, Escharum is no longer in position, so by rights, the Banished should no longer exist. Further back than this, we killed the Prophets back in Halo 2 and Halo 3, so by rights, the Covenant in any faction shouldn't exist anymore. That includes Julim Dharma's faction, that includes the Banished, because they are still the member species of the Covenant, just under a different ideal. Again, by the same logic, we killed the Gravemind at the end of Halo 3. The Flood shouldn't exist. But all three of them still do. The Flood still exist. The Banished and other Covenant factions still exists. The Created still exist. So where could this be taking us? My working hypothesis is that this could be indicating that the Created are actually a faction that are going to return to Halo Infinite, and that we may actually have to deal with the situation, perhaps in some degree something like boss fights, where we fight against Spartans that are being controlled by created AI, with the created AI perhaps altering their perception of reality via their augmented reality visor overlays, making the Spartan feel like we're actually threats to them, when in reality we're not. Perhaps we could approach taking down those Spartans in either a lethal or non-lethal mannerism, which itself could become a mechanic that could lead into other aspects of campaigns down the line, where saving and choosing to non-lethally neutralize the Spartans increases the quote-unquote military power of the UNSC on Zeta Halo, allowing humanity to be that much tougher and that much stronger for dealing with whatever comes next. Something akin, I suppose, to Mass Effect. What I'm getting at here is that yes, it could literally just be chalked up to being an interesting narrative choice for Season 2 to engage players, and I absolutely agree, it is doing exactly that. But given everything else I've just discussed here, there's a damn good chance that there's actually a bigger plan afoot in regards to how the Created could return to Halo Infinite. This is my working hypothesis, so now I want to hear what you have to say about it. Get into the comments down below and give me your thoughts on this emergent hypothesis. And let's see if it actually holds more water than I've already considered, because in all likelihood I've missed a thing or two. So let's fill in the gaps. And hell, if you like the theory, if you want to see something like this happen, maybe 343 aren't planning on doing this, in which case, blow the video up. Let them know what direction you want it to go. We can but hope. Thanks for watching, commenting, liking and subscribing. I just want to give a quick shout out to my patrons and YouTube members: Spartan10148, my Metarch, Dylan, Falcon X003, Kenwood, Irrefutable Justice, Leon, Neek and Ramiz, my monitors, Alvin, Andrew, Brand, Brian, Cameron, Chris, Darian, Devon, Flaming Halo, Greenblood, Kyle, Legions Lost, Michael, Prophet Bear, Spartan and Wolf, my sub-monitors, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my diligent enforcers, and all the other awesome people that have jumped aboard to support the channel over at Patreon. Another shout out to Todd Morrison, my Transcendent YouTube member. And just one quick reminder to support us on all major social media channels, including Discord. Much love from 00. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.